debt sustainability. Interested parties will be able to ask their questions through the platform. The Minister will answer them in due course.
Thank you. Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for the flexibility and for being here online under these difficult circumstances. What I'm going to do today is to present the debt sustainability framework that we will follow for the debt operation that we intend to perform with the goal of restoring debt sustainability and restoring the economic growth capacity of Argentina and providing the conditions for Argentina to return in healthy terms and sustainable terms in the international credit markets. Our intention was to do this differently. We had to adapt the logistics to the current circumstances. We intended to do this with everyone here in presence in person and in different parts of the world. So we very much appreciate the flexibility and the fact that in these very difficult circumstances we are doing this shows the commitment of Argentina to the goal of restoring debt sustainability with the preference of doing it through an orderly process. That's exactly what we intend to do. There is a disclaimer that you will have access to. You can read it there, and also these slides are going to be online at the website of the Ministry of Economy. And my presentation today will have 4 parts. In the first part, I will refer to the current situation of Argentina's economy. I will describe briefly what has been happening over the last 2 years, and I will characterize the economic and debt crisis that Argentina is suffering today. The second part of the presentation will focus on the issue of debt sustainability, and I will demonstrate something that is already evident for all stakeholders, which is that Argentina's debt today is not sustainable. In the third part of the presentation, I will give an overview of how we think the debt operation. I will present the debt principles for our debt sustainability analysis, and I will present detailed parameters on the debt sustainability analysis and the framework that will be the basis of the debt operation. And in the fourth part of the presentation, I will refer to the next steps and the logistical aspects. So it's clear that Argentina today is in the midst of a major macroeconomic crisis. All economic and social indicators show that this is the case. What you have there is a number of data points and figures on inflation and real GDP growth. The average real monthly salary in Argentinian pesos has fallen by 13% from 2017 to 2019. In the same period, the minimum monthly retirement and pension benefits has fallen by 21%. In US dollars, the average monthly salary in these last 2 years has fallen by 42%. And the unemployment rate is already at 2 digits. It increased by 2.3 percentage points over the last 2 years, and it's already at 10.6%. The last data point that we have for poverty rate is 35.4%, and we know that poverty has been increasing over the last few months. So this is a dramatic social situation that the country is facing today. Inflation has been on the rise. It went from 25% in 2017 to 53.7% in 2019. And real GDP has fallen in 3 out of the last 4 years, and it has fallen in the last 2 years. The growth rate of real GDP was minus 2.5% in 2018, and we estimate the rate to be minus 2.1% for 2019. Argentina has made massive efforts, also when it comes to the fiscal front. Over the last few years, there has been a massive adjustment of spending. federal government primary expenditure as a percentage of GDP went from 24% in 2015 to 18.6% in 2019. That's a reduction of 5.4 percentage points in just 4 years. This didn't work. What happened in this context was that the massive reduction in public spending didn't lead to a restoration of confidence in the economy. In turn, it led to a very large decrease in aggregate demand that led to a large decrease in the demand for non-tradable goods, implying a fall in economic activity, a fall in fiscal revenues, a fall in employment, increases in informality, more problems at the social level, more problems at the economic level, and at the financial level as well. But this figure is very important to us. Argentina has already made a massive adjustment of primary fiscal spending. There is no room in the short term for continuing this dynamic, no room at all. This government is committed with economic recovery, and that means that we have to stop a debt destabilizing dynamics in which facing an unsustainable debt burden forces more adjustments in spending that lead to a further contraction in economic activity. On the other side, on the tax revenue side, things were not better. What happened over the last few years is that there was also a massive reduction in tax revenues. Tax revenues went from almost 26% of GDP by 2015 to less than 22% of GDP in 2019. We expect less than 22% of GDP for 2020. This had to do mainly with two factors. One was the decline in economic activity. The decline in economic activity naturally leads to a fall in fiscal revenues. The second factor was the reduction in tax rates, including the tax reform of 2017. If nothing was done, the trajectory in the near, medium, and long term will be the one that you see in the slides in dot lines. If nothing was done, there will be a continuation of a weak tax revenues path, which means that something has to be done on that front if the country intends to achieve the goal of restoring that sustainability. Argentina's debt today is not sustainable. We have to define what sustainability means. And the way we do this is simply we have to see what is the path of primary fiscal balances, and for a country that has debt in foreign currency, what is the path of trade balances that the country can sustain, consistent with the premise of an economy that recovers and that sustains that recovery over time. Therefore, the debt refinancing cost has to be in line with the primary surplus targets in the medium and in the long term, and the growth trajectories for the medium and the long term. There has to be realistic trade balance projections and also foreign exchange reserve accumulation that is compatible with the process of easing the capital account controls. What we face today is a comprehensive problem of a macroeconomic crisis. Resolving the problem of unsustainable debt is a problem that requires addressing the different pieces of the puzzle. So we also have a problem to address on the peso debt front, and in order for the country to be able to ease capital account regulations over time, which is a necessary condition for the healthy development of the domestic capital markets, and also for having an environment that is conducive to the attraction of foreign direct investment, there has to be, over the horizon, a modification of the capital account regulations, and that requires accumulation of foreign exchange reserves. Third, the debt service has to be consistent with manageable peso and foreign currency debt rollovers over the medium to the long term. And finally, in every process of debt restructuring and in every debt sustainability analysis, we have to take into account the role of uncertainty. Today, it's clear that we are living times of very high uncertainty, and that's something that has to be taken into account. This was true before the coronavirus, and is even more true now. So the approach to the sustainability should provide as an element for sufficient buffers to protect the country against exogenous shocks, including global trade shocks, financial shocks, and also black swans, like the crisis that we're living today with the coronavirus. I will characterize the debt situation of the country today as unfinanceable, unaffordable, and unsustainable. Why is the debt unfinanceable today? Because of the high refinancing cost of the debt. You see in this chart how the spreads have been rising over time. 2,000 basis points a few weeks ago, 4,000 basis points today. No country in the world can face capital amortization payments. No country in the world can have access at refinancing costs like the ones Argentina experiences today. What we see here is the gross financing needs of the country, what's been happening in the recent past, and the gross financing needs that the country faces over the next 4 years. This also shows that today debt is unfinanceable. The gross financing needs over the next 4 years go from 22% in 2020, 17% in 2021, and in 2022, and 18% in 2023. This is way above what's sustainable. In particular, is way above the 5% gross financing needs as ratio of GDP that the IMF considers sustainable for Argentina over the medium and long term. Part of what we've been doing recently is to continue serving interest in foreign currency, of bonds in foreign currency, despite the recognition that debt is unsustainable. And we have been doing this resorting to the reserves of the central bank. This was part of what Congress allowed with the enactment of the law of social solidarity and productive reactivation. This shows a commitment of Argentina, first to have a path towards sustainable debt, and importantly, to have an orderly process to restore debt sustainability. So the society has been making the effort to continue paying debt, so we have time to have an orderly process. But this cannot last forever. The intention was to have a sufficient length of time so we could initiate orderly a process of debt restructuring. But this cannot continue occurring after the process of debt restructuring is formally initiated. You see there how foreign reserves have been falling, and we cannot allow, it's not healthy for the stability of the country to allow for a depletion of the foreign reserves. So there is a limit to that, and we are reaching that limit now. Second, we said that debt is unaffordable, and it's unaffordable given the critical social needs of the country. What we see here is that the interest that the government pays as a percentage of its revenues has been rising massively, very rapidly rising. Today is at 18.4%, which is almost the level of the 2001 crisis. In this chart, in the y-axis, we have debt over GDP, and in the x-axis, we have interest over revenues. This is for all countries rated by Moody's, and we see 2 data points for Argentina. Argentina in 2017 in black, and Argentina in 2019 in red. This shows that not only debt over GDP has been increasing very rapidly, but also interest over revenues has been increasing very rapidly. In fact, when we look at the evolution of the expenditure, dividing it between primary expenditure and interest from 2015 to 2019, what we see is that despite the massive fall in primary expenditure, there was an increase in the interest bill of 2.5 times. Interest service went from 1.3% of GDP in 2015 to 3.3% of GDP in 2019. Of course, what this means is that the budget for public policies, which are, and some of those that are absolutely essential for the good health of the country, for the social and economic development, has been undermined. This means more space for health investments, for education investments, etc. The country cannot continue on this path. And third, the debt trajectory is unsustainable, given any measure of realistic primary fiscal balance and any realistic platform for growth trajectories. We see in this graph that Argentina's debt to GDP has been also increasing very rapidly. The gross debt to GDP ratio went from 52.6% in 2015 to 88.8% today. If we just focus on the government debt in foreign currency, what we see that is that ratio went from 35.2% in 2015 to 69% today. So at the end, to make an assessment of how much debt the country can sustain, we have to see what is the path of primary fiscal balance and of trade balances that can be sustained. What we have in this exercise is a computation of the debt stabilizing primary fiscal balance under different assumptions on economic growth and assuming that the country will be able to borrow on average at the current real effective interest rate on the existing debt, which is 5.68%, something that is not happening today. And what we see is that if the country was going to settle on a long-term trajectory of 1% in real terms, it would need to achieve a primary balance of 4% stable. In the other extreme, if the country was going to grow at 3% in real terms, it will have to achieve a primary balance stable of 2.2% of GDP. None of these numbers, none of these targets are politically or socially feasible. It's never happened in Argentina. It will force the country to have an adjustments of a magnitude that would be simply destabilizing, such that the country will never be able to get there. It will never be able to even achieve the growth assumptions that are included in those computations, showing that there is a real problem here. There is a real problem, and this needs to be addressed. Of course, any primary balance target should be realistic. What this figure shows is that since 1961, in only 10 years, the country had a primary surplus equal or higher than 1% of GDP. And again, we are living in times of uncertainty, and this is something that has to be taken into account in the design of a proposal for a debt operation that intends to restore debt sustainability. It is uncertain how much time it will take, especially in the current conditions, until the recession comes to an end. Over the last decades, different recessions have taken different times to be finalized, and the one we have now has already been extended for 6 quarters. I will next move to the issue of the sustainable debt principles. And I will divide the next section into 5 parts. On the first part, we will refer strictly to the issue of the principles. In the second part, I will provide an overview of the debt stock, and I will characterize what we consider as a eligible debt stock for the debt operation. In the third part, we will discuss some operational guidelines. In the fourth part, I will focus in detail on the parameters of the sustainability analysis. So I will be discussing the underlying macro fiscal assumptions. And in the last part, we will analyze the resulting debt trajectory under the baseline scenario. In terms of the principles, what we intend and have been intending to do is, first, to commit fully to the idea that the process needs to have as an outcome a new debt structure that is sustainable. We're absolutely committed to that. We don't want to do an operation that forces us a few years later to go through another restructuring. We need to restore sustainability, and we need to do it once and for all. It is the goal of this administration to put an end to the cycles of overborrowing, to set conditions for long-term stability. What we have been doing is to change the economic approach that the country was following. We defined a horizon. We took a number of measures that intend to set a path towards fiscal consolidation, which we understand as a necessary condition for stability, but at a speed that doesn't undermine the function of the economic system, at a speed that allows the country to end the recession, to restore economic growth, and to sustain that economic growth over time. But as I said already a number of times, we want to do this orderly. Since the very beginning, we intended to be very transparent with how this process would evolve. First, with the law of social solidarity and productive reactivation, we got the possibility of continuing serving the debt using some of the foreign reserves of the central bank, precisely to have an orderly process. Then, the Ministry of Economy published a number of communications. A first communication setting the principles. The country is acting on good faith and wants to continue acting in good faith. That's one of the principles, in good faith, with the goal of restoring that sustainability. In a second communication, we invited the bondholders to send their views on the guidelines of this process, the views in general of the process for restoring that sustainability, and there were 3 different stages of meetings. In the first stage, the unit for the management of public debt sustainability received bondholders and discussions were held. In the second stage, these discussions happened with the Secretary of Economic Policy. And in the third stage, I held some of these discussions, and these discussions will, and these conversations and this engagement in general will intensify. We also published a schedule. We published a schedule in which we laid out the different steps that we would follow towards an orderly resolution of the sovereign debt crisis. We understand the schedule was tight, but what determines the urgency is the economic and social reality. Times are tight because the economic and social situation is dramatic, so we need to do this fast. Meaning that this is something that has to be resolved soon, and we need cooperation on all sides in order to avoid a lose-lose situation. Cooperation on the basis of good faith with the goal of restoring that sustainability will facilitate an orderly process. And Argentina, as I said, will intensify the engagement with its bondholders on the basis of transparency, good faith efforts towards a collaborative process to restore that sustainability, and fair treatment across eligible creditors. When it comes to the breakdown of the 2019 debt stock of the central government, what we face is that 40% of the debt is held by the public sector. 23% of the debt is held by international financial institutions. 8% of the debt is held by the private sector and is denominated in pesos. Other 26% of the debt is held by the private sector and is denominated in foreign currency. And this is eligible debt. Our debt strategy is comprehensive. We're addressing the different parts of the debt stock and the debt crisis in a process that occurs simultaneously, although there are different speeds because of the different characteristics of the process and the different urgencies given the due dates for interest and amortization. When it comes to debt owed by the private sector, the eligible debt will be detailed hereafter, but we are here first referring to debt in foreign currency and also debt in local currency, debt in pesos. We seek constructive discussions with the holders of peso debt with the intention of rolling over these debts while we ensure debt sustainability. This is important. Here there is a good cooperative equilibrium and a superior good cooperative equilibrium and an inferior bad equilibrium. Yesterday we had a very successful swap. We exchanged 310 billion pesos of debt by bonds that now have sustainable rates in real terms on average at 1.2% with maturities of 1.5, 2, 3, and 4 years. We see here a process that is being constructively in which there is an understanding of the two different paths that the country can follow. One in which there is cooperation, the country manages to roll over the debts in pesos. That eases the pressures on central bank financing and allows the country to accumulate foreign reserves. Therefore, it sets conditions for a path towards the normalization of the capital controls. And that is a situation that helps everyone. Next, we have the debt owed to the official creditors. We are discussing with the IMF steps towards a new program supported by the International Monetary Fund. In these discussions, we are including a discussion of the program modalities. And we are also holding discussions with other international financial institutions and bilateral creditors. And finally, we have the debt owed to the public sector that we expect to refinance with the aim of safeguarding monetary and financial stability. When it comes to the debt perimeter, what we face is $24.3 billion for the debt under foreign law for the exchange bonds of the 2005 indenture, $41.2 billion for the foreign law or global bonds under the 2016 indenture, $10.2 billion for the bonars under local law, $3.9 billion for letters, and 3.5 local law exchange bonds from the 2005 indenture. These figures exclude the share of the instruments that are held by the public sector. With respect to the operational guidelines, what do we expect to be the basis of the debt operation? First, the debt refinancing has to be in line. The debt refinancing cost has to be in line with the paths that we have defined as feasible and sustainable for the fiscal sector and for the external sector. When it comes to the fiscal sector, we assume that in the medium to the long term, the country can achieve primary surplus targets that range between 0.8 and 1.2% of GDP. with respect to the growth trajectories, the baseline platform is that the country will be able to achieve with effort in terms of the policies that have to be enacted, including productive development policies, a growth trajectory that ranges between 1% and 2% in real terms of the medium to long term. This is also when the economy grows, imports grow, because there is an increase in the demand for tradable goods as well. Therefore, exports need to grow as well. This is a necessary condition for avoiding the boom-bust path that Argentina has been following in the past. If the economy grows and imports grow, but exports don't grow, eventually what we experience is a depletion of foreign reserves followed by a depreciation of the exchange rate that leads to an increase in prices, an increase in inflation, reduction of purchasing power, another fall in aggregate demand, more recession, and gives continuation to these dynamics of financial instability that is not good for any side. So, underlying the framework, we need to have a realistic trade balance projection that includes foreign reserve accumulation that is compatible with the easing of the capital account regulations. So we have set as the target a return to 65 billion of gross foreign reserves by 2024. Third, the debt service has to be consistent with manageable peso and foreign currency debt rollovers over the medium to long term. And, as explained before, the operation has to provide buffers for protection against exogenous shocks. Let's now turn to the numbers in detail. In the first two lines, what we see in this chart is the evolution for real GDP that will be at the baseline platform for debt sustainability analysis. There is an important clarification here. This debt sustainability analysis was performed before the coronavirus situation. Everyone all over the world is learning about the persistence of the current shock that the global economy is suffering. We are all learning, we are all monitoring day to day what this shock implies for each of the economies in the world. We're doing the same in Argentina. So there will probably have to be revisions to these numbers. It is obvious that there will have to be revisions to the numbers for 2020. And possibly there will have to be revisions for the numbers to 2021. However, in principle, we're assuming that the effects of the shock, even if they persist for some time, will not affect the medium and long-term situation. Again, we need flexibility here, and we need to take account of the uncertainty in which all these projections and definitions of based on platform scenarios are being done. But despite the fact that, as every other country in the world, Argentina is suffering from the effects of the coronavirus crisis, we decided to still not assume that for the medium and the long term, the scenarios will be more pessimistic. So in principle, what we have here is that there will be a cyclical recovery, and by 2023, Argentina would converge to real GDP growth between 1.5 and 2%. The next two lines refer to the evolution of the primary balance. And our debt sustainability analysis considers that the country first has to achieve, as I said before, a scenario of fiscal consolidation, but it has to be at a speed that is sustainable. So in the in the most optimistic scenario, in the upper bound, the country would be achieving the primary equilibrium by 2022, and by 2023, it would achieve a primary fiscal surplus of 0.5% of GDP, and it would converge to a primary fiscal surplus of 1.2% of GDP by 2027. In the lower bound, the country would achieve the primary equilibrium by the end of 2022 and beginning of 2023, and would converge to a primary fiscal surplus of 0.8% of GDP by 2027. In the next two lines, we see the evolution for the trade balance. So in the lower bound, the country will have, both in the lower bound and in the upper bound, the country will have trade surpluses. In the lower bound, it would converge to 1.4% of GDP of trade surplus by 2025, and in the upper bound, that figure will be 1.9% of GDP also by 2025. And in the last line, we see the target for the accumulation of gross reserves in US dollars in billions. So the target is 62 billion US dollars by 2023, and it will continue increasing, passing 70 billion by 2026. What we see now is that with the numbers that I just presented for the fiscal path and for the trade path, if nothing was done, if there wasn't a debt operation, the debt path would be explosive. There would be an exploding debt path. There would not be a possibility to stabilize the debt over GDP ratio. For assumptions are in line with the figures at which the country was borrowing before the crisis started. So all of this suggests that there is need for a debt operation that provides relief, substantial relief, that is consistent with the numbers that I have presented previously. I will conclude with a description of the next steps and the logistics. The government invites the bondholders and bondholders groups to engage over the course of the next week in constructive discussions on the macroeconomic framework and the debt sustainability analysis that I have presented today. We understand that we are living through exceptional circumstances, so we understand that the logistics have to be adapted, and this is what we're trying to do. So the interactions will have to rely on video and conference calls. It was our intention to do a roadshow through different major cities in the world, through the major financial centers of the world, and also to receive bondholders here in Buenos Aires. We understand that in the current situation that it won't be possible, and time is of essence. This is a process that has to be resolved quickly. It has to be resolved soon. Rely on a different kind of logistics for the engagement. We will, of course, prioritize, especially in these circumstances, interactions with bondholders that demonstrate significant holdings. So we encourage all bondholders to continue contributing to the identification strategy that is being conducted by Moro Sodali. This presentation will be made available both in Spanish and in English at the website of the Ministerio de Economía, and a follow-up Q&A document, including answers to questions that are raised during this webcast, will also be posted at the website of the Ministry of the Economy over the course of the next week. So let me thank you one more time for making the time to be here with us today from different parts of the world. We understand that this is a complex process in terms of logistics. We understand that there are people with that are now in different places of the world and different time zones. We deeply appreciate you making the time to participate of this presentation. And then let me emphasize one more time that we have a real problem. We want to resolve this problem orderly, but Argentina is absolutely committed to the premise of avoiding a continuation of a debt destabilizing dynamics. So we are now in a situation in which debt is unsustainable, despite the massive effort that Argentina has been doing over the last few years. It hasn't worked, and Argentina's society is suffering the consequences of this drama. We want to be fair, we want to resolve this orderly, and we very much hope to continue the engagement into a constructive, cooperative, and positive process to put an end to the current sovereign debt crisis. Thank you.